At 6:45 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston, off the island of Samar, watching the horizon fill with the masts of a Japanese battle fleet that had no business still existing at this stage of the war. 36 years old. Cherokee and Muskogee Creek, raised poor in Oklahoma, rejected once by the Marine Corps over a knee injury, before the Navy took him instead. In the next 3 hours, he was going to attack that fleet with a ship 1/20th its size, and become the first Native American in Navy history to earn the Medal of Honor doing it. The force materializing out of the morning haze wasn't a patrol or a screening squadron. It was the Japanese center force. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 23 warships in all, including the Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built by any navy on Earth. Standing between that fleet and the vulnerable landing beaches at Leyte was a single American task unit, 6 unarmored escort carriers, slow, thin-skinned, built to launch aircraft rather than fight surface battles, screened by exactly 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. Evans commanded one of those 3 destroyers. Every man aboard understood, within seconds of the lookouts calling in Japanese pagoda mast silhouettes on the horizon, that the entire invasion of the Philippines was about to be decided by whether a handful of thin-hulled American ships could buy enough time for anyone to help. The Johnston displaced roughly 2,000 tons fully loaded. The Yamato alone displaced nearly 70,000. Her main battery threw 18-inch shells that weighed more than a small car apiece, capable of killing the Johnston with a single direct hit from over 20 miles away, well beyond the range at which Evans's own 5-inch guns could do anything but scratch the paint. Doctrine in this situation was unambiguous. Screen the carriers, lay smoke, and retreat behind it, while the carriers ran for their lives. Evans had a different read on the math. If the destroyers ran, the Japanese battle line would close the distance in minutes and annihilate 6 helpless carriers and every man aboard them in short order. There was no version of survival that didn't require someone to buy time the carriers didn't have. If you want to see how one destroyer captain attacked an entire Japanese battle fleet to save 6 helpless carriers, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Evans. Evans gave the order that would define the entire battle before higher command had even finished processing what was happening. Full speed ahead, lay smoke, and close the range rather than open it. The Johnston's twin screws churned the water white as she accelerated to over 30 knots, cutting between the Japanese fleet and the fleeing carriers. Her smoke generators pumping out a rolling wall of chemical fog meant to blind Japanese rangefinders that could otherwise pick the carriers apart at will. She was the first American ship in the entire task unit to open fire that morning, and the first to launch a torpedo attack against a force that outgunned her by a margin that had no real precedent in naval history. Evans drove the Johnston to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, suicidally close by any conventional standard, a range at which the cruiser's own guns could hit the destroyer almost as easily as Evans could hit her, and fired all 10 of his forward torpedo tubes in a single spread. The Johnston reversed course and ran back toward her own smoke screen as Japanese shells began straddling her, geysers of seawater erupting on both sides of the hull close enough to shower the deck crews. Behind her, one of those torpedoes found the Kumano's bow and blew it off entirely, knocking the heavy cruiser out of the fight and forcing an entire column of Japanese warships to slow and maneuver around the burning wreck rather than press the attack unimpeded. 3 Japanese shells found the Johnston in return before she reached cover. One punched clean through the fantail without exploding, a stroke of pure luck. The others tore into the after-engine room and gun mounts, killing men outright and cutting her speed and power in half in a matter of seconds. Evans himself took shrapnel across his chest and lost 2 fingers on one hand in the same salvo, and simply kept fighting from the bridge, refusing to leave his post for treatment while his own ship burned around him. Behind the smoke, the 6 escort carriers of the group the crews had nicknamed Taffy 3 were doing everything a warship never built for surface combat could do to survive, launching every aircraft they had armed with whatever bombs or depth charges happened to be loaded. Some pilots making dry strafing runs with empty guns simply to force Japanese cruisers to maneuver and by another few minutes. It wasn't enough on its own. The Japanese battle line was still closing, and the Johnston, wounded and slowed, turned back into the fight anyway, rather than fall back to nurse her damage. With her main guns still operational, Evans fought the Johnston like a light cruiser, rather than a destroyer half-crippled and outgunned by 100-to-1 in raw tonnage, engaging Japanese cruisers and destroyers at ranges close enough that her 5-inch shells, useless against battleship armor, still tore apart unarmored superstructure, bridge crews, and fire control equipment on ships many times her size. She helped drive off a spread of Japanese torpedoes aimed at the fleeing carriers, added her own fire to a chaotic multi-ship melee where American destroyers, destroyer escorts, and aircraft attacked from every direction at once, in an effort that looked less like coordinated tactics than sheer collective refusal to let the carriers die. The Japanese eventually brought the full weight of their gunnery to bear on the crippled Johnston directly. Shell after shell found her. Her bridge wrecked, one engine room flooding, her remaining guns firing under local control after the main fire direction system went dead, sailors passing ammunition by hand through compartments already filling with smoke and seawater. Evans stayed on what remained of his bridge, directing the fight with half his uniform blown away and blood running from his wounds, refusing every suggestion that he abandon his post while the ship still had a gun that could fire. By roughly 9:45 that morning, 3 hours after she'd first opened fire, the Johnston could no longer maneuver, could no longer fight, and was taking direct hits from Japanese destroyers close enough to finish her at will. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Of the 327 men who had sailed with him that morning, more than half went into the water with their captain, as the Johnston finally rolled and sank beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. Survivors in the water reported seeing Evans, wounded and exhausted, make it into a life raft or the water alongside his crew. He was never seen again. The Japanese force that had annihilated the Johnston and crippled or sunk several other American ships that morning, including the destroyer Howell and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, both lost fighting the same hopeless odds alongside her, inexplicably broke off the pursuit and withdrew rather than pressing on to destroy the helpless carriers and open a clear path to the invasion beaches at Leyte. Post-war analysis credited the ferocity and sheer persistence of the American destroyer attacks, the confusion the smoke screens and torpedo runs had sown in the Japanese formation, and simple uncertainty in the Japanese commander's mind about what other American naval power might be lurking nearby. 6 escort carriers and the entire Leyte invasion force survived a battle that, by every reasonable measure of ship tonnage and firepower involved, they should never have survived at all. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross first, later upgraded by Congress to the Medal of Honor, one of only 2 destroyer commanding officers in the entire war to receive it. His widow, Margaret, accepted the medal on his behalf in September 1945, as their 2 young sons looked on. His body, like most of his crew's, was never recovered. The wreck of the USS Johnston lay lost for 76 years, before an unmanned submersible finally located her in 2019, resting in over 21,000 feet of water off Samar, the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by man, deeper than the Titanic by a wide margin. Positive identification came in 2021. She remains there today, a war grave at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, marking the spot where a Cherokee farm kid from Oklahoma, who'd been turned away by the Marine Corps, once drove a 2,000-ton destroyer directly at the largest battleship ever built, and bought the time that saved 6 carriers and thousands of men who never knew his name. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if anyone in your family served in the Navy, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Commander Ernest Evans doesn't disappear into silence.